Please keep in mind that this training DVD was originally made to be utilized in New York State. While most of the elements contained in this DVD are taken from the Americans with Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines, a federal standard, your state and/or local codes may be different, and as a result, more stringent standards may apply. Please be sure to check applicable local and state codes for your area.
Greetings. Welcome to Ready, Set, Vote. I'm Helen Ben-Lisa, the Project HAVA Coordinator at the Catskill Center for Independence. I'm here with Mr. Don Wyckoff, my colleague and good friend, who is the Architectural Barrier Consultant at the Center. We're creating this DVD to help you better understand the accessibility components of the HAVA America Vote Act, or HAVA. HAVA, as you probably know, was enacted in 2002 to provide and ensure privacy and independence in voting for all of America's voters. Part of this independence is to make sure that we have physical access to our polling sites. And in order to do that, we need to identify physical barriers at our polling sites. This DVD is designed to take you from start to finish through an actual on-site assessment. We'll show you the tools you need, the process it takes, and we'll show you an actual physical assessment step by step. So Don, what do we need to keep in mind before we get started?
Well, in order to effectively identify physical barriers at polling sites, we're going to need some level of understanding of the tools we're going to use, but also an understanding of what accessibility means. There's a lot of different kinds of disabilities out there. Not everybody's in wheelchairs.
So people who are blind, for
people that are blind, they may have arthritis, they may have a hard time turning doorknobs. Step height restrictions. They may not be able to step up over, say, 4 inches before they have problems in their hips. Understanding these differences in disability will actually help us better identify barriers along the way at a site.
So what's our first step?
Well, our first step is we need to familiarize ourselves with the ADA checklist for polling places. This was put together by the Department of Justice.
And how was that instrument created?
Well, it was created using the American Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines, or ADAG, and it was a consensus of the disabled community that helped to put this together so we could understand what the bare minimums of accessibility are.
So I noticed you have a bunch of tools in front of us. Do we need all of these?
No, we don't need all of these tools. There's just a few that are actually definitely necessary. First of all, we're going to need, obviously, our survey, a pen to take our measurements, 25-foot tape. I use a 25-foot code stare tape. It actually has the American Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines written on the tape, so it's very user-friendly, but any 25-foot tape will actually work. For longer distances, I use a 100-foot rolling tape. Stanley puts this one out. It's good for measuring long distances and determining accessible routes. The digital camera. This is probably one of the most important parts of our arsenal. With a digital camera, we're able to basically click it and stick it, meaning we can take a picture of the inaccessible component of the site and then stick the digital picture into the report at the end. It helps it to be easier for them to identify the barriers that we've found so that they can make the modifications that they need. A bubble level. Now, this is a 2-foot bubble level. I use this for determining cross slopes, angles of ramps, things like that. Most people have these, and I'll demonstrate later on how to use that. We also have the SMART tool. Now, if you've never used a SMART tool, you definitely would want to read on how to calibrate the tool and to understand. It's a little more complicated, but again, it's used for cross slopes and angles of ramps and things like that. Another one of the tools that I use is called a DPG, or a door pressure gauge. Basically what this is it helps us to determine how many pounds of force is required to open up a door. We place this on a handle, give it a push in, and there's a little black O-ring on there that records the measurement of how much pounds it took to actually open the door. Very handy little device right there. If you don't have one of those, is there some other test you can use? There is. It's actually called the pinky test. The pinky is the weakest finger on our hand, and it would help us better to understand what it's like for someone with dexterity issues to open up a door. So we kind of hook onto the door handle like that and pull it open, and if we don't, tear ligaments, it's probably within guidelines.
All right, that wouldn't necessarily work on a doorknob, would it?
No, it would not work on a doorknob. Doorknobs are not considered part of an accessible door hardware. Anything that requires twisting, pinching, tight grasping, little thumb levers or anything like that are definitely not accessible. We tend to use the D-style loops that you can pretty much get a closed fist in and open up a door. Okay, here's another one. This is called the Measure Master or rolling tape. Basically it has the little digits on the end here. We just set that to 0, started our beginning point, wrote along, it records our measurement, and put that on the tape. Good for long distances, things like that. Now those are the basics of the survey, but some of the instruments that I use that aren't exactly basic are things like this. And it's called the accessibility stick. Basically what this little tool does here is it's an all-in-one tool for assessing a polling site or any site really. Basically what it does is it has a little slide out here where I can slide it out to 32 inches because as we know 32 inches is what's required to go through a door. We need a clear width of 32 inches minimum. So this is really handy like that. If I flip it over here like this, you'll see that I have a little grid area. Now, if I take that grid area and I set it up next to a door's threshold, if the threshold goes over that black line there, I know that the threshold is not accessible. You'll also notice that it has a bubble level on the end of it. The bubble is used to determine, the slope of a ramp. Basically, all I do is I just lay that on the ramp like that. If the bubble lines up in the middle of it, I know that the ramp is accessible. Very effective tool. If you're interested in getting an accessibility stick, you can Google it, or you can visit us at www.ccfi.us.
So how many people do we need to do an on-site assessment?
Well, we only actually need one person to do the assessment. Makes the task a little harder, so it's great to have a second person with you. The second person can take the checklist and actually record the measurements that I'm finding, record the number of the pictures that I'm taking. Incidentally, if you are alone on the field and you're actually doing one of the on-sites by yourself, a good tool is a digital voice recorder. This, I just put it in my pocket, press record and let it go, and I just kind of talk out my findings.
Now we know the tools. How do we get started?
Priorities for accessible voting: getting to the polling place, entering the polling place, and using the polling place. Now this may sound simple, but for millions of disabled voters, merely getting to the polling place can present barriers. Take a look at the ADA checklist for polling places, go to page 6 and draw a big no with a circle around it. In regards to accessible parking spaces and access aisles, New York State parking requirements are more stringent than ADAG. Let's examine them.
According to New York State Uniform Fire and Building Code 1106.1, accessible parking spaces and access aisles shall be at least 96 inches wide, or 8 feet. 2 accessible parking spaces may share a common access aisle. Parking spaces and access aisles shall be level with a surface slope not exceeding 1 in 50 or 2% in all directions.
Regardless of whether there is proper signage and access aisle, a slope like this would not be considered accessible parking. When measuring parking spaces and access aisles, place the measuring tape on the inside of the blue line. New York State requires parking spaces and access aisles to be 8 feet wide. For the sake of consistency, be sure to measure all access aisles and parking spaces within the site.
There must be adequate signage in front of the designated parking and access aisle according to New York State Fire and Building Code 1106.4. Each accessible parking space shall be provided with signage displaying the international symbol of accessibility.
Whether you call it the universal symbol of accessibility or the international symbol of accessibility, it must be clearly identifiable either in the parking space or on the no parking sign. The object here is to eliminate any confusion as to what the space is intended for.
Each access aisle shall be provided with signage reading "No parking anytime." Sign shall be permanently installed at a clear height of between 5 feet and 7 feet above grade and shall not interfere with an accessible route from an access aisle.
Place the tape measure on the level surface of the ground and extend the tape to the top of the sign. The measurement at the middle of the sign should be between 5 and 7 feet.
ADAG 4.6.2 states that accessible parking spaces serving a particular building shall be located on the shortest accessible route of travel from adjacent parking to an accessible entrance.
Common sense should be used when determining an accessible route. As we can see, the parking is situated within a few yards of the accessible ramp. An accessible parking area does little good if it's far away from the accessible entrance. If an accessible route requires someone to cross a road, the crosswalk needs to be a minimum of 5 feet wide. Again, as with parking spaces and access aisles, determine the width of the crosswalk by measuring in between the lines. If the ground and surface area at the end of the crosswalk is not level, a curb cut must be provided. A curb cut must be a minimum of 36 inches wide with a slope not exceeding 1 in 12. The flared sides of the curb cut must not exceed 1 in 10. Each curb cut must have a detectable warning, for example, truncated domes or, as shown here, scoring of the pavement. Questions to consider when determining an accessible route. Are there abrupt level changes? Are there steps? Are there steeply sloped sidewalks? Is the ground surface stable, firm, and slip resistant? Is the path of travel a minimum of 36 inches wide? Is there grass, mud, or gravel within the path of travel? An accessible path of travel that is less than 5 feet wide shall not exceed 200 feet without a 5 foot by 5 foot level area for passing and change of direction. To determine this, begin at the entrance of the accessible route and measure to the entrance of the first 5 foot by 5 foot level area. The minimum clear width of any accessible route is 36 inches.
Garbage cans, benches, branches, and signs are but a few of the obstacles one may find along an accessible route. For instance, signs are often unknowingly placed in the path of travel on election day.
Note, there is a water access cap in the middle of the accessible route. A detectable warning should be placed here. Many obstacles along a path of travel are not always obvious and require the surveyor to have a keen eye. Level changes greater than a 1/4 inch must be addressed appropriately.
Any level change up to 1/4 of an inch is allowable. Between 1/4 and 1/2 inch must be beveled, and any level change greater than 1/2 inch must be ramped in accordance with ADAG 4.8.
The water cap in this walkway could present a tripping hazard to someone using a mobility device such as a cane or walker. Remember to record measurements of the obstacle and then click it and stick it. All ramps must have a level landing at the top and bottom of the ramp. The level landing must be a minimum of 36 inches wide by 5 feet long. In this case, the landing at the bottom of the ramp requires a right-hand turn. Because of this change of direction, the landing must be 5 foot by 5 foot. In order to determine the surface area of the landing, I'm measuring from the wall to the end of the handrail and from the edge of the ramp to the stairs.
Handrails that extend past the edge of a ramp must turn back on themselves or return to the ground. The minimum width of any ramp at its narrowest point must be at least 36 inches.
To determine, measure between the handrails or the narrowest point of the ramp.
Handrail height is between 34 inches and 38 inches.
The maximum run of a ramp shall not exceed 30 feet before there must be a level landing. That landing must be at least 5 feet long and as wide as the ramp run leading to it. For every 1 inch of vertical rise, 1 foot of ramp run is required. For 2 inches of vertical rise, then 2 foot of ramp run would be required, and so on. In order to determine the slope of the ramp, we are using a 2-foot bubble level and measuring tape. Raise the lower end of the bubble level 2 inches from the surface of the ramp. The bubble should not exceed the left line. When using the accessibility stick to determine slope, place it so that the bubble is on the low end of the ramp. Here too, the bubble should not exceed the left line. When a ramp changes directions, a 5 by 5 level landing is required. In this case, we have a switchback, which would require a landing of 5 by 7 feet. To determine the dimensions, measure the distance between the handrail in both directions. Take width and length measurements between the handrails. Treat all sections of the ramp as individual components. Here we are again determining the slope of the ramp using the bubble level and the tape measure, or the accessibility stick. Do not assume there will be consistency in the slope of any section of the ramp run to the next. The same holds true for the measurements of all ramp components. Handrails are required on both sides of the ramp and must be continuous. You should be able to walk from one end of the ramp to the other without having to lift your hand from the surface of the handrail. Handrails are required to be a minimum of 1 1/2 inches from the wall or railing they are mounted on and should never rotate within their fittings. Level landings at doors are required to be 5 foot by 5 foot. To determine this, measure from the door to the edge of the landing surface, and for the width measurement from the end of the ramp run to the edge of the landing surface. Accessible entrances that do not automatically open either by sensor or push-button control require a minimum of 18 inches of latch side clearance. The reason for this is so a person using a wheelchair has room enough to maneuver next to the door to open it. Otherwise, they would be opening the door into themselves. To measure, place the end of the tape measure where the latch side of the door meets the jamb and measure to 18 inches. Accessible door hardware are opening devices that can be used with one hand or a closed fist and do not require tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. For persons with arthritis or dexterity issues, this D-style loop handle that can be opened with a closed fist is easiest to use. The pinky test can be used to approximate the amount of force required to open the door. Exterior door pull force should not exceed 8 to 10 pounds.
Doorways shall have a minimum clear opening of 32 inches with the door open 90 degrees. Measure between the face of the door and the opposite stop.
Ensure that the maximum mounting height for accessible door hardware does not exceed 48 inches. To effectively determine the amount of pressure required to open a door with a panic bar, place the DPG or door pressure gauge closest to the latch side of the door and push the door open with the door pressure gauge very slowly. Pushing too quickly will give you a false reading. As you can see, the O-ring measurement is well below the recommended maximum allowance of 8 to 10 pounds for exterior doors.
Some obstacles that may be found on the interior accessible route are water fountains, furniture, stairs, and voter registration tables.
Interior obstacles can be present the moment we enter a building. As you see here, the doormat is not securely attached. All rugs must be securely attached. A quick fix for this is to use double-sided tape or Velcro. With any inaccessible feature, remember to click it and stick it into your report. When measuring rug pile, it is better to measure with a yardstick or straight ruler. The tab on the end of a tape measure will not effectively penetrate the pile. Door thresholds or any level change up to 1/4 inch is fine. Between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch must be beveled, and any level change greater than 1/2 inch must be ramped in accordance with ADAG 4.8. Now, elevators need to meet several very specific standards. It would be difficult to address them all within the time frame of this DVD.
If you encounter elevators along the accessible route, please consult ADAG 4.10 or contact us at 1-888 New York State HAVA.
It is common to see floor mats along high-traffic areas. If these coincide with an accessible route, they must be securely attached. Remember, for any inaccessible element found along the accessible route, click it and stick it.
Ground and floor surfaces need to be stable, firm, and slip-resistant, not slip-proof.
A waxed or high-gloss floor could present traction problems when wet. If you encounter such a floor surface, note it in your report. There are specific requirements for tables. Tables that are used for voter registration and table-mounted voting machines must comply with the following.
The bottom of the table surface cannot be lower than 27 inches or higher than 32 inches. Knee clearance must be a minimum of 19 inches deep by 30 inches wide.
While tables may appear to be identical, do not assume they are the same. Always be sure to measure for consistency. There must be 5 square feet of clear floor space in the front of all voting machines. So our survey examined some fairly typical elements of polling sites. We found that most of the things that we surveyed complied with the American Disabilities Act accessibility guidelines and the Help America Vote Act. We did, however, encounter some obstructions. For instance, the path of travel. We had that little water cap that was in the middle of the path of travel, pose a tripping hazard.